Hey there, welcome back to the exam preparation video series for SC-300, Microsoft Identity and Access Administrator. My name is Peter de Tender. I'm a lead Microsoft technical trainer here at Microsoft. This is the second episode out of a total of 4 episodes in this series. In this episode, we'll focus on implementing authentication and access management. We will cover how to plan, implement, and manage Microsoft Entra ID user authentication. Plan, implement, and manage Microsoft Entra ID conditional access. Next, manage risks by using Microsoft Entra ID protection, implementing access management for Azure resources by using Azure roles, and last, implementing global secure access. Here is a list of all the different skills you may be tested on. These are sometimes referred to as may include, meaning they may or may not be on your exam. This list isn't exhaustive, and while we won't be covering every skill in this video, be sure you are able to perform these skills before taking the exam. If you went through the first episode of this series, you already know my advice for this slide. It is to pause the video, grab a screenshot, and use it as your guideline throughout your studying and learning journey. And the same goes for this slide here, completing the list of items you could be tested on as part of the exam. Let's kick it off with this overview of different authentication methods. As you can see, we're really following the best practice of passwordless authentication, using a range of options. For the exam, you need to know the different options available, how to implement them for your users, as well as overall how to manage them. While they all provide an additional layer of security, keep in mind that not all these listed options provide the exact same level of security or can be used in the same use case. Building up on the authentication methods, they all fit in the category of MFA or multi-factor authentication. From an exam perspective, you need to know how to manage the tenant MFA settings, as well as how to enable MFA options for individual users. Obviously, I'm sure you are aware that every Microsoft tenant is now required or enforced to use MFA, so not too much additional configuration is required. And SSPR or self-service password reset is also key here, giving users the ability to change or reset their own password without administrators or help desks involvement. Also, make sure you understand how the auditing of all this works using Usage and Insights section within Entra ID. One of the MFA options we zoom in here is Windows Hello for Business, replacing the traditional passwords with strong two-factor authentication using biometric or a PIN pattern. Make yourself familiar with the 8-step process here, understanding how the authentication process works in detail, starting from the certificate-based credentials all the way through how your private keys are stored on the TPM chip. Having users authenticating using MFA feels like a standard to me nowadays, but to really elevate your user authentication protection. But another angle is the security optimization process. It's the user procurement process, which could involve disabling accounts or revoking user sessions. There's different ways to disable accounts, depending on the topology you have in place, the administrative process you use, meaning is it manual process from the on-prem Active Directory, directly from the Entra ID portal? Are you using Entra ID synchronization? Or, like in this example, why not automating using the process, using PowerShell? Then here we're focusing on the traditional Active Directory Kerberos protocol, which you're going to use to authenticate on-prem users, which can now also be enabled from an Entra ID cloud perspective in a few different ways. You can deploy Active Directory domain services servers as virtual machines in Azure, or deploy Entra Domain Services, which gives you that Active Directory-alike features from within an Azure PaaS services model. And then the third option is deploying Entra Kerberos, which facilitates Kerberos authentication for Entra ID joint clients. This also requires hybrid identities for the users authenticating from those devices. Another touching point in the authentication topic is Entra Password Protection. This is a built-in capability in Entra ID, automatically locking the account from sign-in after a certain set of failed attempts, and repeating the same process for a longer timeout when more failed logons are happening, like a cyber attack. Password protection can be enabled for hybrid deployments using password hash sync or pass-through authentication. Apart from the discussed MFA, the other security optimization for authentication is CA or conditional access. This provides an additional layer of protection before allowing authenticated users to access the data or applications in the tenant. Some examples of conditions you can configure are IP address ranges. Is the device known to Entra, like Entra ID joint, Entra ID registered client? What is the health state of the device as defined in your mobile device management? How is the user authenticating? And so on. For the exam, you should be familiar with several of the available policies, recognizing the use cases and knowing how to implement, monitor, and obviously troubleshoot conditional access. Another layer of identity protection is using app protection policies, which targets user sign-in frequency, or said differently, after which time is a user asked to sign in again. Using the APP policies, you can control the conditions, such as forcing a more frequent re-logon, depending on the device, authentication type, or when using non-persistent browser sessions. APP also provides some level of integration within MDM, a mobile device management, as well as MAM, or mobile application management. There's even more on conditional access here, where I want you to remember the continuous evaluation of users' access using the newer CAE or conditional access evaluation. The main purpose of this is revoking users' access based on their behavior. And a little tip here, you find the CAE settings both within location or session portion of conditional access policy. Conditional access also provides you with authentication context, which relies on custom attributes you can define to secure application data and actions in applications like SharePoint, Cloud App Security, and PIM. Organizations can define up to 99 context definitions. Now, when discussing conditional access, we also need to position protected actions, which basically are permissions which have been assigned based on conditional access policies. You start with setting up conditional access policy, followed by adding the protected actions, and then obviously testing the outcome. One use case for protected actions is where you would force administrative users to satisfy a phishing-resistant MFA policy before they can make changes to the conditional access policies themselves. Thinking about one of the core objectives for the exam for this functional group is the create or configure action. Apart from the already discussed conditional access policies and settings, remember that you could start from predefined policies, making it easier for you to manage, but also relying on the Microsoft Security Framework best practices. Apart from conditional access policies, Entra ID comes with an additional set of policies. The first one here is sign-in risk policy and user risk policy. What is their purpose? How are they alike and yet somewhat different? The next one here is MFA registration policies, where you assign the MFA requirement to a set of users, basically preparing your organization to self-remediate from risk detection in identity protection. Now, while not a policy as such, remember you also have the identity protection report for risky users and risky sign-ins. I always describe the risky users as the most public-facing users in the organization, like your executives, marketing folks, sales. Because of the nature of their job, they're more vulnerable than the more traditional office workers. While I would recommend you enforcing MFA and conditional policies for all your users, any missed identity is a potential security risk, right? But especially watching over those risky users. And yes, I've been pointing at users a lot throughout this session, but this slide wants to remind you about workload identities. Why are these so important to highlight? Well, for a lot of reasons. They can't perform multi-factor authentication, and often don't come with a formal lifecycle process like a regular user, but they can still be flagged for risk detection. From here, we take a little segue to Azure roles for the next coming slides. We already discussed Azure roles versus Entra ID roles in a previous episode. You can expect to be tested on the exam on how to implement default Azure roles, as well as how to manage custom roles, as you can see in this screenshot here. Step 1 involves creating the custom role, followed by assigning the role, which works for custom and built-in roles, to your security groups. Keep in mind to always work with the principle of least privilege. As always, you can perform these admin tasks using the Entra ID or Azure portal, but for the exam and probably in your day-to-day job, you will look for automation using Azure PowerShell or Azure CLI scripting. One example that is highlighted here is the configuration of access to Azure Key Vault, the secret store resource. Key Vault is one of those services in the platform supporting both Azure RBAC as well as having its own access policies. For new deployments of Key Vault, we recommend the more granular RBAC, role-based access control, allowing you to define specific access permissions to keys, secrets, or certificates. This brings us to the last topic in this episode, Entra ID Global Secure Access. This allows organizations to control network traffic at the end-user computing device, as well as control to define route-specific traffic profiles. The first option within Global Secure Access is Private Access. It's basically replacing VPN, allowing access to specific applications, providing support for Kerberos authentication. There's integration with PIM, and those are basically the key benefits. The second option is Internet Access, which allows you to enable internet traffic forwarding, integrating web traffic filtering, and it also gives you an integration with the already discussed conditional access. One example of Internet access within Global Secure Access is connectivity to Microsoft 365, which shouldn't be a surprise. You have to know how to configure this for the exam. I know this was a big episode with a lot of topics in the authentication and access management space. While the exam focuses on your administrative skills, meaning do you know how to integrate, set up, and manage policies, it will also assume you know how to plan for authentication. More on the architect side if you want, as well as knowing how to evaluate effective permissions for Azure roles. This brings us to the end of this episode of implementing authentication and access management, where I discussed the 4 subjects: how to plan, implement, and manage Entra ID user authentication, followed by the same for Entra ID conditional access. Next, we discussed how to manage risk by using Entra ID identity protection and closing the episode with implementing access management using Azure roles. Remember, this group accounts for 25 to 30% of the exam, so keep that in mind when preparing. Thank you for watching episode 2. Be sure to join me again for episode 3, where we cover planning and implementing workload identities.